Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source. I'm so glad you're back with us. We took a little bit of a break over the summer. I'm really excited for my guest today because we're going to be talking about all sorts of things open source and probably some things about tech in general. I want to bring out my friend Den. Den, do you want to say hello, introduce yourself?
Hello, folks. I am Den Delimarsky. I'm a technical advisor at Microsoft, and I do a bunch of random stuff. That's how I describe my job.
Doing a bunch of random stuff. Do you maybe want to talk about random stuff? So maybe a little bit of backstory of it. It's like I think a lot of people know you as some from some other persona, right? Do you maybe want to talk about how you came to internet fame, if you think you're internet
How I
famous?
came to internet fame. Hey, I don't think I'm that internet
Sure.
famous.
Okay.
I don't know if I am. But I've been a product person at Microsoft. I was a software engineer. I started my career way back, and depends on what era you want to count. But it was about 2014 when I worked on Outlook Desktop. Then I worked on docs.microsoft.com. So if you're reading technical documentation of Microsoft, thank you. It's all thanks to our contributors. And so I worked there for about 5 years, had a stint at AWS where I was a product person for some event-driven services, and I'm back at Microsoft, which is exciting.
Yeah. I think a lot of people were very happy when you announced that you were coming back. So one of the things that I like to talk about with folks is kind of how they got started in tech. So a lot of people they've told me their origin stories where if you're in a certain generation, maybe you got magazines in the mail or CDs in the mail, and that's where how you write programs. Maybe some other people they got started with some web development things. Other people got into tech just by tinkering with things. Do you have like an origin story where you came across tech and you're like, yeah, this is the thing that I want to do the rest of my life?
Every villain has an origin story. No, so my origin story is fairly, I want to say, uh, very stereotypical of somebody in tech. So I grew up in Eastern Europe. I grew up in a family of educators. And so from early age, I'm talking 6, 7 years old, we had a computer in our house. And I remember back in the day just finding out that my dad has this big like chunk of metal that was a Soviet copy of an IBM computer, right? So like back in the day, there's all this industrial, we take from you, you take from us. But essentially they copied an IBM personal computer. So we had that in our house. And at some point I just asked my dad, like, can I turn it on? I just want to turn it on. I don't even know what I'm going to do with it. I have no idea what the thing does. So we turned it on, and it was something like DOS. I think it was some variation of DOS. And at that time, I started just typing random commands, and that's where I learned about things like if you type in dir, it will show you the list of folders that exist in that directory and the list of files and whatnot. So it was very fun. Then made a transition to a 486 computer. So that
Okay.
was an Intel machine. And that's when I actually started getting into coding. So this is where, at the time, it was Windows 98 and Visual Basic 6. And
Okay.
I just remember that it was so exciting. The fact that I could drag and drop things on a form and then double click on the button and write code for it and just make it pop a text message or, show a picture. And after that, I was hooked. After that, I would just not shut up about, I want this book that teaches me Visual Basic 6. I want this other book on Visual Basic 6. And I would just devour those books nonstop. Like I'm talking reading 600-page books in like a couple of months, just like doing exercise after exercise, not because like I did not know what I'm doing, to be honest. I just
Sure.
like literally I saw a code snippet in the book. I would copy paste it mentally, just write it out and see what happens. And yeah, that's kind of how it started. And since then, it kind of stuck around, and I knew that that's what I want to do.
That's awesome. I think a lot of origin stories, at least from my experience talking with folks, it's all about this interest in understanding things, right? Like this natural I guess, necessity or need or want to learn about something they don't quite understand, right? I think that's a lot of it. I think one of the things that's also very interesting to me as well is just how you got to that point, right? Like, I love the idea of like, can I just turn this on? I remember when we got our first computer. I was a sophomore in high school, and like we got the computer on layaway. It was this whole thing, and like I took it apart day two, and my dad was like, comes up and he's like, "What is going on?" I'm like, "Oh, I just want to like take it up, open up and see." He's like, "You need to fix it right now, like right now." I'm like, and I didn't know what I was doing, so I was plugging stuff in. I'm very surprised I didn't fry the motherboard, um, but it's just it was a great learning experience. Yeah. So
That's the story.
yeah,
That is the story. I'll tell you this. This is where it's funny because that's where I see that this is very typical path for a lot of people in tech. Well, it's the fact that when I had the 486, I had to upgrade to an AMD Athlon. It was a CPU. I vividly remember that. My dad got the parts. He handed me the boxes and he said, "And it's now your turn to upgrade it. And if you fry it, you have no computer." And I had to figure out and read the instructions because it was pre-internet.
yeah.
And I read this, okay, like this is this type of socket, and this is how you insert it. And you need one of those like anti-static
Oh
straps that,
yeah,
hooks
yeah,
to yeah. So knew nothing about that. But somehow I did not fry it and it worked. So all
yeah.
was well.
Like, so obviously I think you were probably in a similar boat. Like, I don't know if you were you like in high school, like during like the build your own internet like craze, like when every kid had to have an internet, like a our build your own computer phase, I'm sorry. Like where everybody built their own home PC for gaming Counter Strike. Was that a thing when you were in high
Yes,
school?
I
Yeah.
think it's middle school. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yep. Counter
So
Strike was one game.
yeah.
Yep.
So I remember like my friend, like he's got all this. He's pulled up some money. I don't know how he made that much money, but he was able to pull up some money to like buy enough components to build his own PC. And he's putting all these pieces together, and like turns on. It's got a beep, but like nothing happens. Like, and so our friend's dad, who happened to be, I think he worked at IT in some particular world, we like literally like ran to his house with like this 400 pound like tower, like fix this.
Yes.
And he's like, he's messing around with it and all that stuff. And then he's like, you messed up the CMOS. And we're like, what is that? Like, what is the CMOS? And at that point in time, I was like, okay, I don't know anything about this. I need to figure out more because like I don't know what the CMOS is. I don't know what the BIOS is. So I tried to get an understanding of all these different things, and that was really really fun for me. And then I got started like doing web development, and I kind of was a web developer the rest of my life. Well, until this point. Um,
Right.
and I think one of the things that's very interesting is like, did you know right away that you wanted to like get into tech and like have it be your career? So you like went to college, went to university, and you're like, this is my thing. I'm going to do this.
You know, when I was like when I first started dabbling in VB6, I did not really think about tech as a career. As a matter of
Sure.
fact, I was always telling my parents, I'm gonna be a programmer and a biologist. So this is like the perfect combination for anyone's career. Like, like that Aziz Ansari joke that goes about, I want to do business and biology. Mine was programming
Yeah.
and biology.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing. But then, kind of as I grew up, I was like, no, I like tinkering video games. I got into modding Grand Theft Auto Vice City.
Oh yeah.
That was
Oh
the
yeah.
game.
Yeah. No, that's
And
yeah.
then you'd mod and you'd like adjust the gravity for the cars, and they would start like flying off
Yeah.
and getting like the colors and just the structure. And then I got in some 3D modeling where it's like, okay, well, I need to write the custom model for this car that's going to look like, I don't know, a Nissan GTR or something like that. And so I did some of that. And I kind of realized that, you know what, like I actually like doing this. I find this as a creative outlet. Like some people paint, some people write poems, some people, sing. To me, this was coding,
Yeah.
just writing code, just building things. And my parents supported me through that, thankfully, because they saw the effect that it had on me that I was so keen on developing that aspect of my life. And so it kind of like after that, it was a no-brainer for me when it came time to kind of go to college. And I was like, yeah, I want to do computer science. I want to do computer science because that's what I want to do for my career. And then when I was in college, I wrote this blog post about, if we all remember the Zune player.
Yeah.
So I found a way to download Zoom stuff through the client without some kind of the guardrails that were put in place. So I wrote a blog post about it, and it was like, hey, here's how to do this. And then my now good friend Clint Rutkus, we all know Clint, and if you don't follow Clint, go to @ClintRutkus. He drives Power Toys at Microsoft. He reached out and was like, hey, so like, why don't you work with us instead? And that was kind of he opened the door for my career. And after that, I helped their team a little bit, and then I came back as an intern, and they just kind of all spiraled out of control from there. But it just was, I knew it from, I'd say like, I knew that I wanted to make it a career maybe my senior year of high school.
Sure.
Right. But even then I was just like, I don't know which company I'm going to work at. I don't know. Like, I always wanted to work at Microsoft because I knew VB6 and Windows 98.
Yep.
But beyond that, like, who am I? Right. But here I am.
No, it's funny that you bring that up, because I had, like, I don't know if your school did the same thing where, like, your senior year you kind of wrote like your 1 year, 5 year, and 10-year plan, which I think is absolutely ridiculous thinking back now.
Right.
Like, who would ever, like, what high school kid knows what they're doing in 10 minutes, let alone 10 years? And I remember I specifically wrote, like, working at Microsoft. I'm from the area, right? I'm from Washington State, so working at Microsoft was like a big deal, like, because it was in your face your entire adolescent life. And then when I started working there, I was like, oh, like, because I always had this feeling like I wasn't good enough to work at Microsoft. And then when I started working there, I was like, oh, like, there are great people and there are people that aren't so great, like every other job. And there are people who love their job and there's people who just clock in, clock out. And it's interesting. I think every tech company is like that, right? Where, like, there's all this mystique, and then once you're inside, you're like, oh, the sausage making process is the same no matter where you are. Which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, exactly. People think that there's some big magic happening behind the scenes, when in reality it's just like, it's people like you and I that are writing code, they're collaborating, they're building things, they're shipping things, they're learning. It's kind of like, it's not as secret as people think.
Yeah, it's very true. It's very true. Like, I think the one of the things that's kind of made this thought of like, okay, like, working at a tech company is almost impossible. You have to, like, know big O notation, and you have to, like, know red black trees, and, like, all this, like, high computer science things, is this concept of, like, open source and how all these tech companies now adopt it. And you don't need, well, I guess that's not fair. It's not necessary for you to go down a traditional computer science path to get into big tech career anymore.
Absolutely.
So one of the things I'd like to chat with you about is, do you have like a notion of what your open source journey, where it started? Like, I was working on a project and I had to rely on some open source technology, or was it very much like, hey, I see that all this code is out here, like, let me play around with it?
Yeah, so my open source journey started back in the day of Codeplex, which was pre-GitHub.
Yep.
And how I got brought into that was, again, shout out Clint Rutkus. Clint managed a project. It was a Coding for Fun toolkit at the time.
Yep.
And I was just getting into building things for fun for myself with Windows Phone, because that was the new thing back in, I want to say, like 2009, something like that. And I remember, because I kind of encountered the problem of, well, the controls that I needed from the richness of WPF applications, Windows Presentation Foundation, for those that don't know, it was lacking. Like, I just could not find the right, like, a date picker or something that would allow me to switch the calendar view. And I was like, okay, this seems kind of ridiculous that we don't have that. And then I started searching for it, and I ran into Coding for Fun toolkit on Codeplex. And that offered all those tools. Like, there's a date picker control, there's a calendar control, there's kind of the color picker. I was like, this is exactly what I want. And then when I started kind of fiddling with it, I also clicked with me. It's like, well, I don't like this behavior. I'm going to go tweak it. And by virtue of me having access to the source code, I could just tweak it and recompile it and just have it run right there. And it feels like, okay, this is the way to do it. And since then, all the projects that I built personally, I've released as open source because I was like, well, what if somebody else will be in my shoes, like as I was with that toolkit, where they are like, hey, this is a great tool that solves the scenario, but I want to tweak it just a little bit. Yeah, sure. Clone the code, tweak it, or whatever you want.
I think that's pretty spot on. I think one of the things that's very interesting about open source is this idea of like, oh, like maybe I have the same problem, maybe other people have the same problem as me, so I might as well figure out a way for people that run into the same situation. I talk about this a lot when I talk about things like Presence Light, this open source tool that I built.
Yep.
The reason why I built it is because I wanted this experience, and then I was like, oh, probably other people like this, and then it turns into this thing, and now people love it. I think it's one of those things too where when you're out looking for things too, like the first thing that when I have an idea of like, oh, this might be a cool app, is like I start frantically searching on GitHub if it exists or not, right? Because I have this belief, and that's probably not fair, that all of like the really like the not very complex ideas that you could come up with, like, oh, this is a great idea, like it's already been done, right? It might not have gotten as much traction, or it might didn't get all the way there, or whatever, but somebody started most ideas. Unless you're inventing a new technology or something like that, or a new product comes out and you need to interface with it. But for the most part, like most of the things that common technologists probably need or want as a part of their day, it's already been done. And it's just ways of finding them or ways to amplify them if they aren't being used very heavily. Which I think is really, really important. I think that leads to something I'd like to talk with you about, because you were a consumer and a contributor to a fairly well-known like open source initiative, right? Like the whole docs.microsoft.com thing.
Sure.
Right? And so I'm curious to know like what your experience was like, if you can, I don't know if you can or if you're allowed to or not, talk about maybe the origin for, hey, let's have all of our docs open source. Oh, and let's have this entire platform that takes all of this content in static files and turn it into something meaningful.
Yeah, so I don't think well, first of all, I want to make it clear that I cannot take credit for any of this stuff, because
you were the face of it though, so you can take all the credit for it.
I was the unofficial self-assigned face, if you will.
Sure.
But the origin came from so back in the day I worked with Dan Fernandez.
Yep.
Shout out Dan at Daniel FE on Twitter. And that was the idea, where we looked at the documentation, and the team then realized that prior to Docs, Microsoft is using a proprietary lockdown system that if you wanted to write Docs, you'd have to write these cumbersome XML files, which was, as we all know, XML is the format to write documentation in.
It's true.
So we wrote XML files, and that was very cumbersome, and it took like weeks, if not months sometimes, to write and publish Docs. Right? It's a very, very cumbersome process. So this is where, because of the existence of GitHub, because of the existence of Markdown, it all kind of, the stars aligned at the right time, and folks realized that, hey, maybe we should do this the same way that open source projects do, right? Because the reality is, when we think about great ideas, I also like to think of it as an alignment of resources that become available at that particular time, right? Because if the iPhone did not exist, Angry Birds would not exist either, right? Or like in that format that it does, like, or QR code trackers or whatever else, you name it. So it so happened that at the time when this project kind of was in the early nascent stages, GitHub existed that was very well matured, and then Markdown as a format existed, and then folks on the team way above me realized that, hey, like, this is the future, and it's very straightforward, right? Like, if I want to write Markdown files, I can just go to GitHub, create a pull request, fix a Markdown file, fix a typo, add an image, add a sentence, and be done with it.
Yep.
That's it. That's the process. And that kind of, I think it, in retrospect, it seems obvious because you can think of it as
Sure.
like, well, of course that makes sense.
Yeah.
But back in the day, it's like, yeah, how many times are you going to reinvent the CMS? Right? Like,
As
how,
somebody who
like,
has done lots of CMS work in their career, yeah, like a lot of
right,
people want to reinvent the CMS, right? That's the sad thing.
right. Exactly. But this is where the team decided at the time that the CMS is not the right
Yep.
approach. And it's the right approach is to make it kind of like a static site, which, hey, little known fact, Docs is a static site. Like a lot of people don't realize that we use a tool called DocFX behind the
Yep.
scenes, which I know, Isaac, you called it out yesterday in one of your tweets. But yeah, we use DocFX, which is DocFX. Well, all it does, it converts Markdown into HTML files, and in some cases, it adds a bunch of rich stuff like, .NET REPL. Shout out to Scott Hanselman's team and the .NET team for building that out. But they plug that in, and it's HTML that sits behind a CDN, right? Like
Yep.
that's the magic. Like, yeah, sure, there's a lot of SRE related stuff that goes on to make sure that the site is up and available. And there's kind of, it's a huge team effort. But at the end of the day, it's a static site.
Yep.
Yeah, it was a fun project to work on, and it was a fun project to work on from its inception because, it's a lot of the detailed stuff was kind of hidden from the public eye, but we went through a lot of the migration work as an example, because one of the principles that we established at the time was that, look, if we're going to move to a new system, we're not going to lose any content. We're not going to create a system by which the .NET API now disappears.
Yes.
Or now all the links to .NET API that exist in Visual Studio documentation become broken.
Yep.
So there's a huge effort to both convert, redirect, find out where those bad links are. So it took years to get to a state where we were comfortable in saying, okay, this is good.
Mm-hmm.
But it turned out pretty good.
Yeah.
From what I can see and what I can tell from the community. And we've been so lucky. And this is where, again, I want to emphasize that when we talk about projects of the scale, it's never just one person.
Sure.
It's never just one team. Our contributors, our open source contributors that came from outside Microsoft, were instrumental to the success of the Docs ecosystem. Like, we have people that help us make better docs. They write entire articles. They update screenshots, right? Like, people from outside Microsoft contribute, and we are so fortunate to be able to work with them. And I think that's the benefit of open source, is you bring people together into a community, you work together to figure out the right approach. And it's not one of those like top down, we tell you how to do things.
Yeah. And I think, full disclosure, like my first introduction to open source was writing docs for docs.microsoft.com, helping out Myra Wenzel and Scott Addy and all those folks over on the .NET team, like migrate from the old system to the new system, right? Like we're talking about thousands of pages, and like, unfortunately, automation doesn't work in some cases. So you have to actually go through a lot of stuff. And that was kind of where I really understood the value of contribution, right? Because for folks that don't know, like the docs team at Microsoft isn't very big. Like the content developer team, like the people who write docs for Microsoft, it's not as big as you think. So it's important for people, if they feel like they can contribute in a way, please do, because it's a lot. It's a lot to take on. And I think one of the things that you mentioned is really interesting. Is you didn't just make the process open source, but then you opened it up for contribution, which, I mean, I can't think of another large tech company that has gone down that path. Right? And I might, like there's not a lot of, and look, I don't, if Google does this, if Amazon does this, if Facebook or all the other huge tech companies, if they have some contribution section to their docs, I'm not aware of, I apologize, but it's not as openly known or transparent as the docs process. So I think, what was the decision to, we understand that there is this huge potential for community contribution and community feedback loop. Like, let's take advantage of it instead of just having outward content only.
Yeah, well, I mean, it all starts from just asking the question who you're serving. You are serving your customers. Like, as Microsoft, who's our customer?
Yep.
It's people that use Windows to build applications. It's people that build websites on Azure.
Mhm.
They are the experts, right? Like you know exactly how you're using the API. You know exactly how you're going to call that specific HTTP endpoint.
Yep.
And you're going to be also the person that can realize and say, this does not work the way you described. Because full disclosure, when we work at any big company, like insert company here and there's a blank space, you can put any company, you always work in this little bubble.
This is true.
Right? You work in the bubble where you think that like these things work on my machine. Because I tried it, but like you're in a corporate environment where you have the all set up and provisioned for you, you have all the policies in place, so it's easy and it works. And you write the doc and say, hey, follow these simple 5 steps, and then you're going to be good on your way. And then you get outside the building and you realize that somebody that works in the federal government might have a completely different set of constraints, and your API does not work. Right? How are you going to find that out? There's no way to find that out unless you either, one, have a very frequent feedback loop with those customers, which at scale is hard because you have millions of customers, or you can open up your docs and say, hey, if something ever breaks or you feel is like incorrect or incomplete, tell us. Just open a GitHub issue. Again, it's as simple as opening it. And I know that I'm using very reductively like the word simple, but it's a matter of go to a GitHub issue and say, hey, this doesn't work. Here's some steps to reproduce. Or maybe you found out that, we misspelled an API endpoint or parameter, and then you can literally open a pull request and say, fix typo.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it's about reducing friction, right? Like, you don't want, like, obviously, like, saying things like simple and things, that's not fair. But I think one of the things that's really important to call out is that it's bringing the bar to a level where it's as low as possible for most people. Like, still, like, let's be completely realistic. There are some people that the bar is still too high, right? And it's about taking those people and trying to help them get to that level, right? Whether there's lots of reasons why people don't, like, you can be in software for 30 years and not want to do any of this, right? When I talk about open source, and that's okay. But if you want to and you feel like you're struggling getting that first step, making the barrier to entry as low as possible is the goal, is the job. And I think that's the underlying reason why everybody at every company does what they do when it's community in quotes oriented, right? It's about reducing the friction to use the tools that company produces.
Yes. I love that idea that you just mentioned, where it can be your first step towards open source, right? Because I know for myself, if I put myself like back in the day in my shoes in college or middle school, if somebody told me like, oh, go contribute to open source, I'd be so intimidated I would not touch a computer. Because it's scary. I mean, to me, when I think of contribution to open source, the first thing that pops to mind is like, oh, I'll have to go and contribute something to the Linux kernel.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, like, right. It's like, which is scary. It's like, I know nothing about kernel development. And even if I did, it's like, okay, well, am I thinking about this the right way? There's all these expert people that know way more than I do. Am I right? Like, you're overthinking it versus when you have something as simple as documentation. And again, simple in quotes here because it's not really simple, but the idea where you can start and you can say, hey, I will go to the .NET docs and open an issue and work with Myra to make sure that we discuss, hey, like, how do I make sure that folks that are new to .NET can use this API properly? Right? Like, because I was new, I didn't understand this. Maybe we can phrase this better. That is a fantastic contribution. And this is where I want to emphasize that contributions to open source documentation are just as valuable, if not more valuable and important, than contributions to code. Because people mistake that, right? They think that's like open source is only code. It's not. Documentation, open source is just as valuable.
I have this conversation with people all the time. Like, one of the things that I do, I'm on the marketing committee for the .NET Foundation, and I have this program that we created called Project Spotlight, where we call out projects in the .NET Foundation that exist that people should, if they don't know about it, it's a way to amplify the work of great community contributors. And the first thing that I always say is, hey, contributor, person who writes code in their free time for some great open source project in the .NET community, would you like people to help write your docs for you? And the answer is always yes, right? Because the
Yep.
documentation, like that work never ends. It never ends.
It really never
No.
does. No.
And it's one of those
Your product
things.
changes.
Yeah, and all you have to do is be patient to write docs, right? Because, and I don't want to stereotype, but one thing developers really lack as a general thing is patience, right? We're very impatient people, and that's probably not
Yes.
fair, but it's pretty true.
I know I am.
Yeah.
I am,
So
right? Like if somebody told me like docs, I want to write code.
exactly. Or you want to just get your problem solved, and then the docs come later. And whenever somebody talks about contributing to open source, I'm like, well, is there a technology that you like and that you use? Is there a repo out there? And people don't think that writing issues is contributing. Having discussions in GitHub is contributing. Having conversations on different channels, whether it's Twitter or Stack Overflow, that's open source contribution. It comes in all different flavors. The problem starts when you start to treat open source as a service
Yes.
instead of some a collaboration mechanism between other developers. I'm guilty of it. I was that, to quote a friend, backroom developer, dark matter developer who would literally download NuGet packages or download GitHub things and never contribute back because I didn't care. And then I realized,
Right.
probably later than I should have, that this is free time work for people, and people have this passion to solve problems, and the least that I can do is help in any way I can. Does that mean that I'm going to, using your canonical example, going to go into the Linux kernel and start writing like terrible C code or whatever the kernel is written in? I don't even know. That's how far off from that particular stuff I am. But if I have interest, I can at least try to contribute. And look, some open source projects they put up a pretty high barrier for contribution by choice, and that's
Right.
okay.
Right.
That's okay. Like maybe they don't want people just opening up issues and pull requests constantly because it's too much noise. Maybe they have a particular roadmap for how they want to do things. So it's really important to point out is that open source means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and how can all of those people's needs be satisfied? Because at the end of the day, we're all just trying to solve problems, right? Whether it's problems for a
Yes.
company we work for, solving problems for a personal project, solving problems because your wife is asking to back up her photos and she doesn't want to use Google Photos anymore. Like all of these things, and it's about finding the avenues that are going to lead you to the most success, right? And if you're not enjoying it, you don't have to be there. And that's okay. But
Right.
if you like you want to be there, please do.
Yes. 100%. This is where I also feel like there's this sometimes unhealthy emphasis on, we see open source as a contribution avenue. It's an avenue for people to kind of, get their feet
Yep.
wet and get started. And that's great. But it's also not an obligation.
Mm-hmm.
You don't
Yep.
need to, it certainly can help your career to be an active contributor to open source. It brings you
Yes.
visibility, but that's not the foundation,
Nope.
right? It's not going to be well, okay, if your GitHub, the tile, on your profile shows you that you don't have those green squares for every
Oh
day, then
yeah.
you're a failure.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
No, that contributions is about you deciding that you have the time, you have the means, you have the resources to do it.
Yep.
And if you don't have those, that's okay. I don't expect somebody that is an engineer with 3 kids that has to worry about a lot of other things to spend time contributing to open source in their free time,
I mean,
right?
yeah,
Like,
I don't think it's definitely not fair. I think the expectation that we need to put on people in tech in general is that everybody lives their life differently. I mean, look,
right,
I got a wife, I got 2 kids. If they didn't exist for whatever reason, I probably wouldn't be where I am right now, but that's a whole different thing. But if I was, I who knows what I would want to do in my free time? Maybe I want to write code 18 hours a day, right?
right,
Maybe I don't. But it also, like, the biggest thing is it's about understanding that behind every piece of tech that you consume, there's a person or set of people behind it.
Yes.
And
Yep.
once you realize that, you have to understand that most of these people are doing it for themselves and for you at the same time. Because I say this to people a lot too. If you're writing open source and you're not getting any, like, if you're writing anything and you're not getting enjoyment or money out of it, like, do something else, right? Like, if you're, yeah.
My my favorite emails is it's funny, I got this the other day. So I have this open source project. So I used to have a Nest camera
Mm-hmm.
that I got annoyed by the fact that I could not store the recording locally. It always goes to the cloud.
Yep.
It's like, all right, well, I'll figure out how to do this. I wrote this tool. It's on GitHub. It's called Foggy Cam because I like the San Francisco fog and I like cameras. So combining the two. And all it is, it really just kind of, it talks to the kind of the Nest protocol, the API. You authenticate with your own credentials, and it just copies your own video stream locally. And a project that I, again, did in my free time. I kind of maintain it on and off when I have time, again, because it's kind of the biggest resource that right now we have.
Yep.
And it is, I got an email the other day where somebody was like, oh, I haven't seen an update to this tool in the past like X months. If you're not going to update it, you shouldn't bother building it. And I was like, well, okay. Well, first of all, I built it for me.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I did not build it as like, it's not a product. I don't market it. I don't sell it. I don't support it in the way that you can support any commercial product. I built it for me because I like doing this stuff. And I had a problem. If you can, it's open source. You can go to GitHub, and Isaac, I said you posted a link. So go there, take the code, modify it, tweak it, do whatever you want with it. Right? Like, it's open.
Yeah.
And this is, to me, it's fascinating to see the reaction of like, well, if you're not going to maintain it, don't bother building it. It's like, well, my point was not to make it some super successful mega project. It's like, I did it because it's fun, right?
Yeah.
And I find it fun that mentality exists in the open source community sometimes, where it's like, well, the author should be spending all their time maintaining this because I have this issue. Yeah. No, okay, you have that issue. You can go fix it. That's why it's open source.
Yeah. So it's funny that you bring up this idea of like, you can contribute or you can take it and do whatever you want with it. Recently, I have started to find that there are a lot of forks of projects that I have been aware of that are old, that are no longer maintained, that are very well maintained by their forks.
Yeah.
And I came across this the other day and I was like, oh, like, that's an interesting thing, because somebody said wasn't a transfer of maintainership. Like, the repo didn't switch hands. Somebody was like, look, I'm not liking where this is going, or I think I can contribute in a way that's outside the scope of what the person had in mind. So I'm going to go off and do my own thing.
Yes.
And that creates another community, right? I'd imagine there's a lot of, I've seen it, where somebody will put in the README, I don't maintain this anymore, look at this fork. And it's somebody else's fork. And it's that is a crazy thing to think about, where it's, hey, you built something, like, let's take your Foggy Cam thing, for instance, right? Like, maybe somebody wants to not just add, like, maybe they want to do other things with it. Maybe they want to be able to build a web wrapper for it, or whatever, right? Like, you don't want to do that, probably, but somebody else might want to. And there's this opportunity for people to contribute in that way too, where it's kind of starting not at step 0 of a project, but like at step 5, right?
Yes.
Because that's exciting too for people, because a lot of people have a hard time just starting with their ideas, right? But taking an existing idea and finding ways to contribute. Like, the best feeling that I have is, like, for my silly little open source projects, like, people, like, I get pull requests. I'm like, wait, you mean you spent time out of your day to, like, update my silly little thing? Like, that's awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And sometimes I have to tell people, like, that's not really, I can't, like, one thing that I imagine you probably get with your open source projects is somebody will come in and say, oh, you're probably doing this wrong, let's do it this way. And the wrong way is a way that I don't know how to write code. And it's like, you know, And I'm like, okay, I love your contribution. Thank you so much. But I can't take this PR because I can't maintain your code. And you're going to disappear.
Right. Right. No, this is such a again, I think it's a familiar problem for a lot of
Yep.
open source maintainers, period, because there's this misalignment of understanding why certain things are built and how they're built, right?
Yep.
If you're building something for yourself, like I'm not territorial at all about my open source projects.
Yep.
If you want to take it and rebrand it and then use the code and just drop in a reference and say, hey, this came from FoggyCam, great.
Yeah.
By all means, please do that, right? It's like, I don't care. But at the same time, it's like the expectation is, yeah, look, I have other responsibilities.
Yep.
I have to do things in my day-to-day job and after work. I have a family that I can just say, hey, I'm going to be spending 24/7 just maintaining this project. And this is that, I don't want to call it entitlement, but it's probably a little bit of that entitlement,
Sure.
right? Where you have that, well, I have this problem. I found this bug for my scenario. You have to go fix it now because it's broken.
Yep.
Like, no. It's broken for you. I get it that it's a problem. I know. But again, this is a product that I'm not getting paid for. I don't work in it during the day.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll get to it when I get to it,
Yep.
right? It's like, it's simple as that. Now, the other side of this too is when you start running into those scenarios where things break under very specific circumstances for those environments, right? And it's kind of blown out of proportion because now you're like, oh, this is a big problem. Your product sucks and this is not working. And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's not because one, this is not designed for it. And two, it's because, you're one person that reports this issue. It's not a global problem. Right. Like there's a lot of these things that I think in open source, it's very, very important to emphasize that it's not just about, when somebody releases a product as open source, that does not imply that now you're open to tell them what to do, how to do, because it's a problem for you personally.
This is why I always, like, my de facto response when anybody opens up an issue is I look at the issue. I think for about 15 seconds, how much work would this issue be? And do I have the means to do it? And if the answer is, I can't get this done in an hour, I say, I'll look into it, but I would love a contribution. So please open a PR. And usually people disappear. Because, again, it's back to that concept that I talked about earlier about open source as a service, right? Like, some people, they just want to consume, and that's okay. But you don't get to just consume, but also provide unsolicited feedback without wanting to contribute, right?
Right.
And even like, and when I say contribute, like something as simple as like, can we have a conversation about what you want from this? Maybe I can take on that work.
Exactly.
Right? Like, I'm not expecting a PR, but if you're going to complain about something not working, it reduces my interest in helping, right? As a contributor, right? Because there's other things I'd rather do. Plus, I don't know if you have the same thing, but I have ADHD, so like I'm on to the next thing every single time. Like, even if it's done, like in software's never done because there's always going to be bugs. There's always going to be things. But my interest in maintaining something, especially when I no longer really use it at scale, is challenging for me. So I'm always looking for like the new shiny object, and forgetting that a lot of people want my shiny object, right? So yeah, I mean, there's struggles all around. So I think we just ranted about open source maintainership problems for like 20 minutes. I'd like to talk a little bit about, there are a few things that outside of writing code and writing docs that people do to further enable the open source community. Like some people, they write blogs, some people do podcasts, and you do both of those things. So, why do you want, or not want, that's not fair. Why do you feel this need or this urge to be out there and talk with the community in a way that's valuable, not just for yourself, but for others?
So I'll start with the blog. So we'll talk about the blog and a podcast. So my blog, den.dev, very easy to go to. I started the blog because I got inspired by Jeff Atwood. So the co-founder of Stack Overflow, Jeff had this website called Coding Horror, which is his own blog, where he very informally talked about a lot of the things that he worked on, how he made career decisions, building a computer, and it was just so fun to read. Like, I would spend hours a day just going through the archive, just going through the website and be like, oh, what does Jeff think about this, this, right? And again, it was one of the few blogs that I had the pleasure of just, sometimes you have blogs that you have to, Google with Bing for an issue, and you would land on somebody's blog page and be like, okay, this solves my issue. Coding Horror was one of the blogs where you could literally just browse it through the days. And I kind of looked at that and said, hey, this is interesting. I wonder if I can do something similar. So I started my own blog. And again, I would just blog about stuff that I would explore, right? Like the Xbox Live API. How does that work? I'll put it together. Or the Zune API at the time. How does it work? I'll put it together. I had my first internship. I'll document it. And it was kind of pointless. To be clear, I did not start the blog with the intent of like, I'm going to monetize this and make thousands of dollars a month from it. It was never the goal. It was just more of a fun thing that I started for myself. And it just kind of, after that, I realized that I would see folks come in for specific issues like, oh, I had this exact same problem with setting up a Ubiquiti Edge router to be as a switch. And you wrote this, one blog post that tells how to do this. And it solved my problem. And I was like, oh, that's great, right? Because I thought I'm the only one that had this problem. Apparently not. Or, a couple of months ago, I had an old camera, like it's actually behind me, but a Nikon D3100. And that camera does not have a clean HDMI output. So if you would connect it to something like Camlink or to a capture card, it shows you all that, like the photo information about ISO and F. And so I wrote a blog post of like, how do you actually connect it and clean up that to make sure that it looks decent if you want to stream with that camera? Because I had that problem. I have an old camera. I did not want to spend a bunch of money on a new camera. And that post right now in the past couple of months is the most popular post on my blog. Go figure, right? Like I did not plan for this. It's not a big plan that I had for, how to promote. Like, no, it all came organic, just sharing the experiences. And that kind of like my blog has always been the amalgamation of personal experiences and things that I just enjoy doing, things that I do, things that are on my mind. And I found that people find it useful too sometimes. And the best thing is when I will actually search for an issue online and then stumble across my own blog post from 2012. And I'd be like, I knew it. Right?
Well,
the best thing.
People will say like, don't blog for anybody but yourself in the future. Right? Like
that's pretty much what I do.
There's something to that, right? Like there are a handful of things that I forget a lot, and I'll search and I'll search on the internet, and it'll go back to a Stack Overflow post that I posted, and somebody answered it 15 years ago, whatever, right? And I'm like, oh, I should probably like bookmark that. It's like, I don't know, something like how to do anonymous types in link or something like that. Like something that you don't know the syntax forever, but it is what it is. So it's one of those things where I think especially as people get more and more saturated with content, you tend to forget things like simple things that you do every day. You forget them more and more often. So it's one of those things. It's not just tech too. Like, how do I do this? Like one of the things that I've started to think about is like doing a podcast about dealing with a small child and like trying to figure out like what do you do with a small child and like thinking about it from like an engineer's perspective. Like how do you solve a problem with your child but from a tech perspective? And I've been thinking about this and I'm just like I should probably just do it. But I think that the meta point is there's an opportunity for you to always be learning, even if it's from yourself in the past.
Yes, actually, that's a very good point, because that's another thing that I noticed when I write. In your head, you solve a problem, you write some code, you test an API, and you're like, yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
But then when you start writing it out, you start realizing, okay, I have a blind spot where like, actually, if I would think back to how I did it, I missed this one part. Let me write it out.
Yeah.
So it helps me clarify my thought and outline. Like, imagine the person reading your blog post knows nothing about what you're doing.
Yeah.
They have zero context. They have no knowledge. They're reading this as the first thing. How would you give them that max context?
Yeah.
And this is, I think, where it helps me refine my thought. So the blog post was, like you said, it's blog for myself. And it so happens that by proxy, it helps some people. And that's great. But at the end of the day, if somebody comes to me and says, your blog sucks, and it probably does. And that's okay. I'm totally fine with it.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with the blog sucking. Like, as long as you think that it is good, like, or provides value. Like, I mean, I don't know if you're like this, but I feed off, like, I can take about 75,000 negative pieces of feedback, and I get one, and it's worth it every single time.
Yeah.
All you need is,
I do
the
not
one.
care. Yeah, I do not care about negative feedback because I get a lot of it on a lot of things. There's a difference between constructive feedback, right? With somebody can tell you that, hey, your writing here was unclear. Can you improve that? And I was like, that actually makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. This is unclear. Let me go fix it. Versus somebody is like, you should delete your entire blog. Like, all right. Well, I don't care about that.
I don't know about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a very thick skin in that regard. But yeah, blog, very fun, personal thing. The second one is the podcast. So the podcast was an interesting thing because one of the realizations that I had back at the start of the pandemic, when I started the podcast with a friend, was like, if we talk about our careers nowadays, like for example, you and I, and everyone is going to have a very different journey of how they got there, of what are the lessons learned, what are the mistakes they made throughout their career. Right. And this is where the more I think about it, about the podcast, the more I realize that the value in it is unlocking those insights of what are the biggest lessons learned that would be so key to where you are today that you did not know about or that were not obvious. Right. Because there's a lot of podcasts that talk about things like, hey, tell us about how great you are.
Yeah,
right?
like my thing. Like my thing where I just talk about how great I am, and then I let you talk about how great you are.
Well, right, yeah, we were great. So my dream was on you. Yeah. But essentially, it's more about figuring out, okay, how do you get those insights that if I put myself in the shoes of somebody early in career, that somebody with those just starting out, I made a lot of mistakes that I wish somebody would tell me and say, hey, you should not be thinking about this way. There's an alternative that's slightly better. And this is the goal of the podcast, is to unlock those so that as people early in career or mid-career progress, they can kind of say, oh, okay, like if I talk to somebody that is as prominent as like Dan Olson in product management, I know how he does things, how he thinks about this topic. If I talk to somebody like a web developer, like on Twitter, Not Waldorf, or Monica Dinculescu, who's a fellow Romanian. She's been at Google. She thinks a lot about like creative aspects of code, right? And putting that out. Like, how do those people think about these career problems that we all have?
Yes.
But it's like, it's kind of locked in this chest of the secrets, the career secrets that people keep so tight, and they're like, yeah, we're not going to tell anyone.
Yeah.
Like, it's unlocking those insights is what the podcast is all about. And that's, again, I find it fun, not because I want to be the next top podcast. Not at all. I don't care. If I have 10 listeners who find this helpful, that's all. That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah. I think one of the things that you said that was very interesting is like learning from mistakes and figuring out, like, because everybody's career path is journey. I like to tell people, I like this concept of falling face up, right?
Yes.
And like this concept, like everybody's dropped something, and if it's face down, you're like, oh no. But if it's face up, you're like, I can survive. I can survive if it falls face up. So it's all about taking every opportunity that you fail at and making a positive out of it. Because every piece of feedback that you get can be constructive, even if the feedback is, I don't interface with that person anymore. Period.
Yes. And yes. 100%.
Yeah. So I think that's go ahead.
No, that's what I was gonna say. Feedback is a gift.
Yes.
I've heard that somebody else say, and unfortunately I blank on the name, but this woman mentioned on another podcast that feedback is a gift. Nobody is obligated to tell you anything. right? So when somebody tells you how to improve, when somebody spots your mistakes and says, hey, you could have done this slightly differently and you could have had a different outcome, be thankful for that.
Yes.
And again, this is we're talking about constructive feedback. It's not somebody that says, hey, you suck at your
Yep.
job. Well, thanks,
Yep.
right? Like, this is great. And what do I do with that? But if somebody actually comes and takes the time and says, the way you spoke in that meeting made other people feel uncomfortable
Yes.
because they felt they were not heard. This is great. Thank them for that. This is a great opportunity for you to improve because they were not obligated to give you that feedback. They could have sat quiet. You would have made the same mistake in 7 other meetings.
Yes.
People would have hated you, and you would be out of your job in a couple of
It's
months,
very true.
right?
It's very true. I think we live in a world where people are fed up with people that don't have some form of empathy. And, you
Yes.
know, as long as you are trying to do the right thing, like, look, we're all human, we're all going to make mistakes, and it's important to realize that your actions have consequences, right? In many different forms, whether it's you upset somebody, whether you lose your job, whether you lose things that are worse than your job, whatever, right? Every action can has a potential negative consequence, even the ones that are 100% golden, right? I'd imagine that there's been many a times I can speak in my life, but in your life, we were like, this is going to turn out swimmingly, and then you do it, and you're like, oh,
Oh,
not
yeah.
so much, not so much. Um, so we're running out of time, and first off, I want to thank you, Den, for hopping on and chatting with me.
Of course.
I do know that you're extending your capabilities to another medium. Do you want to talk maybe about the paper-based medium that you're in the process of working on?
The paper-based medium, yes. So I'm writing a book on product management,
Oh,
and you can go to pmtrack.co. That is the book that I'm writing. You can join the wait list, and basically, it's a brain dump of everything that I know about product management through my career. So don't listen to me as the expert in product management, as the sole expert, because I'm still learning a lot. But this is just kind of through my years of helping folks early in career understand the product management space. This is more about just kind of sharing my view on kind of the field, what helped me. And again, caveat, it's all through my own lens.
yep.
So tweak it, adjust it, and hopefully in the next year in 2022, first half of the year, I'm releasing that book. It's going to be available online. It's not going to be print, funnily enough. So it's going to be a virtual paper medium, I guess.
Yeah,
A virtual paper
that's what I was
medium.
told about the Kindle. It's all virtual paper.
Yes, yes. So
Yeah.
it's going to be virtual paper and a video series. So
Oh,
if you're
cool.
bored of reading, you can always watch some videos of me explaining you and me, not necessarily ranting, but more of just like talking about these different concepts.
Yeah,
So hopefully that will be helpful for folks to understand the field and learn as much as I learned. Because again, I'm looking at it from the perspective of I want to make sure that folks don't make the same mistakes that I did early in my career and help them grow.
that's great. So as we wrap up, thank you again so much, Den, for hopping on and chatting with me. I usually ask my guests one last thing before they leave. So if you
Sure.
could think of open source or technology in general, and you had only one word to do it, what word would that be?
Collaboration.
Collaboration. Perfect.
It's always
It's always
about
about collaboration.
people. It's always about collaboration with people. It's not about, it's not about fame. It's not about how many GitHub stars you get or how much adoption you get. It's about collaboration. You can collaborate with some wonderful people on some pretty meaningless projects and still make it fun.
That's true. That's true. And it's all about the value that you get and the value that you provide. Not out in the world, but with the people that you're working with, which is super important. And collaboration
Yes,
is right on top of that. So again, Dan, I want to thank you
absolutely.
so much. For everybody around, you can check out den.dev as well as a bunch of links that I put in the Twitch chat. He's pretty everywhere. So I want to thank you again, Den, for hopping on, and for everybody, enjoy your day and take care. See you next time.
Thank you, Isaac.